That cheer is all about Tory MP, or now Labour MP, Christian Wakeford defecting to the Labour Party. A big moment against Boris, and it's not the first time a number of Tory MPs have defected to the opposition because of Boris. However, if you think that's bad, wait to the end.
David Davis. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Welcome back, everybody, and we're back with PMQs. Please consider clicking that subscribe button if you're enjoying these videos. Before I get into the PMQs and what Boris has been saying over the last few days, I do want to talk about an interesting comparison I'm starting to notice between Boris Johnson and another tricky dicky, Richard Nixon. Now, from all evidence that we have, Richard Nixon's men were the ones caught breaking into the opposition party's headquarters, got caught. And the thing that Nixon did, that we have evidence for, is that he covered it up. He tried to stop an investigation taking place into his men for having broken in and trying to bug the Democratic headquarters. The commonality between these two characters, these two leaders of nations, is that both of them have been caught, or at least their subordinates have been caught, doing the wrong, and both of them, by the looks of it, have tried to cover it up. And the other interesting thing is how Nixon reacts when he gets caught and how Boris has reacted since he's been caught.
I was trying to contain it politically, and that's a very different motive from the motive of attempting to cover up criminal activities of an individual. And so there was no cover-up of any criminal activities. That was not my motive. But
breaking into the Democratic headquarters and trying to cover up the deeds of your men is illegal. And for Boris, covering up the parties, which were also illegal, is wrong. And this is part of the reason why he needs to resign. And that's not the only comparison. Have a listen to what Richard Nixon says about the botched attempts to try and resolve these issues.
Made a crime, an impeachable offense. These are legalisms. As far as the handling of this matter is concerned, it was so botched up. I made so many bad judgments.
Now let's have a little bit of a listen to what Boris has been saying over this time period, and you're going to see some stark similarities.
What I can tell the right honourable gentleman is that all guidance was followed completely during number 10.
What I want to repeat, that the guidance is there, and I'm, very, very keen that people understand this.
Was it a party where the guidelines were followed, or was it not a party?
I can tell you that the guidelines were followed at all times.
Well, did you investigate that yourself? Have you satisfied yourself that that is the case?
I have satisfied myself that the guidelines were followed at all times.
I've just seen reports on Twitter that there was a Downing Street Christmas party on Friday night. Do you recognise those reports?
I went home. Hold on.
Would the Prime Minister condone having a Christmas party?
What's the answer?
I don't know.
It wasn't a party, it was cheese and wine.
Just be clear, it's not. Is cheese and wine all right? No. It's a business meeting.
I'm joking.
That I understand and share the anger up and down the country at seeing number 10 staff seeming to make light of lockdown measures. And I can understand how infuriating it must be to think that the people who have been setting the rules have not been following the rules, Mr. Speaker, because I was also furious to see that clip. And Mr. Speaker, I apologise unreservedly for the offence that it has caused up and down the country, and I apologise for the impression that it gives.
My remarks seemed to make light of the rules that people were doing everything to obey. That was never my intention. I will regret those remarks for the rest of my days, and I offer my profound apologies to all of you at home for them.
I know that today Allegra Stratton has resigned, and I wanted to pay tribute to her. All the evidence I can see is that people in this building have stayed within the rules. If that turns out not to be the case, and people wish to bring allegations to my attention or to the police or whoever, then of course there will be a proper sanction.
And now it emerges that you hosted a Christmas party quiz with groups of people in various rooms in number 10 when such things were banned. Have you asked Simon Case to investigate you?
I can tell you once again that I certainly broke no rules. All that is being looked into.
Everybody will have looked at that photograph, and to suggest that that is a work meeting is a bit of a stretch by anybody's analysis. So I think there are very serious questions to be answered, but just look at the photo and ask yourself, is that a work meeting going on, or is that a social event? And I think the answer is pretty obvious.
I want to ask you about the latest allegations on Christmas parties. Did you and Carrie attend the Downing Street party that was organised by Martin Reynolds on the 20th of May?
All of that, as you know, is the subject of
He thinks it's all so funny.
A proper investigation by Sue Gray.
So have you already been interviewed by Sue Gray, and if not, do you object to her questioning you again about this?
All that is subject for an interview, for an investigation by Sue Gray.
Dominic Cummings says you're lying about the May 20th Bring Your Own Booze Downing Street event. He says you were explicitly warned personally by him, and your private secretary Martin Reynolds was also warned that this was outside the rules and should be cancelled, but you went ahead anyway. That's been confirmed to me by a second Downing Street figure. You, in contrast, say you had no prior knowledge of this party. You thought it was a work event. Have you lied to the public and to Parliament?
No, Beth, but I want to begin by repeating my apologies to everybody for the misjudgments that I've made, that we may have made in number 10 and beyond, whether in Downing Street or throughout the pandemic. And I do know how infuriating it must be for people up and down the country in view of the huge sacrifices that people have made. Nobody told me that what we were doing was, as you say, against the rules, that the event in question was something that we were going to do something that wasn't a work event. And, as I said in the House of Commons, when I went out into that garden, I thought that I was attending a work event. That nobody told me, and nobody said that this was something that was against the rules, that was a breach of the COVID rules, or we were doing something that wasn't a work event, because frankly I don't think, I can't imagine why on earth it would have gone ahead, or why it would have been allowed to go ahead. My memory of this event, as I've said, is going out into the garden for about 25 minutes for what I implicitly thought was a work event, and talking to staff, thanking staff. I can't remember exactly how many, but for about 25 minutes I was there. I then went back to my office and continued my work. In retrospect, as I said to the House of Commons, Beth, if I had my time again, I would not have allowed things to have developed in that way. And when I went out into that garden, yes, I should probably have told people, I should have looked around and said, well, we've got to go back indoors, or this isn't the right way to do things.
The idea that you walked into the garden, there's 40 people there, the tables are laid out with food and drink, and there's alcohol being served in the middle of a lockdown, and you think that's a work event. That is just ludicrous, isn't it? You are just taking the mickey out of the British people by suggesting that. You know how silly that sounds, don't you?
I think what people need to do is wait and see what the report says. But I repeat my deep apologies to people for mistakes that may have been made on my watch.
But you see that looks ridiculous. It sounds ridiculous.
I repeat my apologies for any and all misjudgments that were made, for which I take full responsibility.
2 boozy parties held in the garden, in the buildings of number 10, the night before Prince Philip's funeral, when the country was in national mourning. Was having to apologise to the Queen about those parties the night before she put her husband of over 70 years, she laid him to rest. Was that a moment of shame for you?
I deeply and bitterly regret that happened, and I can only and renew my apologies both to Her Majesty and to the country.
It's interesting as well, after listening to all of that, the knives have certainly come out for Boris, which is why I showed that clip earlier. Let's have a listen to PMQs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last year we were told by the Prime Minister there were no Downing Street parties. Then it turned out there were parties, but we were assured that no rules were broken. Last week we heard that rules may have been broken, but that he thought it was a work event. And now yesterday from the man who wrote the rules, it was, well, nobody told me what those rules were. Mr. Speaker, 5 weeks ago the people of North Shropshire were clear, and the people of North East Fife are being clear to me now. No matter the excuse, there is no excuse for taking the British people for fools. Will the Prime Minister agree it is now time for him to resign?
No, Mr. Speaker, but what I can tell her is that, as I said to the House last week, I apologise sincerely for any misjudgments that were made, but she must contain her impatience, Mr. Speaker, and wait for the inquiry next week before she draws any of the conclusions that she's just asserted.
Now, it's interesting to hear Boris keep talking about having to wait for this report. Well, interestingly, Nixon didn't. Now, on the flip side, he waited for an impeachment to begin, which started off in the House of Congress, and he was impeached through that. However, it would still have to go to trial for the Senate, but instead of that, Nixon quit. But have a listen as to why Nixon claims he put in his notice and resigned as president.
I might have won, I might have lost. But even if I had won in the Senate by a vote or two, I would have been crippled. And in any event, for 6 months, the country couldn't afford having the president in the dock in the United States Senate. And there can never be an impeachment in the future in this country without a president voluntarily impeaching himself. I have impeached myself. That speaks for itself.
How do you mean I have impeached myself?
By resigning. That was a voluntary impeachment.
Now, we don't have the ability to impeach in this country. The only thing you can do is write to your MP, hope they're Conservative, and that your complaint will get noticed enough that they'll start to have doubts about their leader. Now, I find it interesting because Boris could still resign, and probably should because everyone's calling for his head. And let's face it, all the Conservative leaders haven't lasted. They've all been forced out since David Cameron. It's going to be an interesting time, but the other important thing to take from what Nixon said is the country's in gridlock because everyone's focusing on that. And what's everyone's focus on at the moment? Boris and these parties. Let's have a listen to Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I start by warmly welcoming... Can I start...
Listen to the Prime Minister.
Can I just say, I expect people to listen to the Prime Minister. I certainly don't want the Leader of the Opposition shouted down. You might not like the day, but this is the day that we've got. Yes, Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not bothered. I assumed it was directed over here. Can I start by warmly welcoming the honourable member for Bury South to his new place and to the Parliamentary Labour Party. Mr. Speaker, like so many people up and down the country, he has concluded that the Prime Minister and the Conservative Party have shown themselves incapable of offering the leadership and government this country deserves, whereas the Labour Party stands ready to provide an alternative government that the country can be proud of. Mr. Speaker, the Labour Party has changed, and so has the Conservative Party. He and anyone else who wants to build a new Britain built on decency, security, prosperity and respect is welcome in my Labour Party. Every week, the Prime Minister offers absurd and frankly unbelievable defences to the Downing Street parties, and each week it unravels.
I've been elected the chair. I don't need to be told how to conduct the business. So if somebody wants to do some direction, I'll start directing them out of the chamber. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I see the very noise. I'm sure the Chief Whip has told them to bring their own booze.
Order. Let's try and get on with questions. It's going to be a long day if not. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, first he said there were no parties. Then the video landed, blowing that defence out the water. Next he said he was sicker than furious when he found out about the parties, until it turned out that he himself was at the Downing Street garden party. Then last week he said he didn't realise he was at a party, and, surprise, surprise, no one believed him. So this week he's got a new defence. Nobody warned me that it was against the rules. That's it. Nobody told him. Since the Prime Minister wrote the rules, why on earth does he think that his new defence is going to work for him?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, he talks about the rules, and let me repeat what I said to the honourable lady across the aisle earlier on. Of course, Mr. Speaker, we must wait for the outcome of the inquiry. But I renew what I've said, Mr. Speaker. But when it comes to his view,
nobody believes what you say. Can we have a little less? I want to this Prime Minister like I wanted to leader of the opposition. I want the same courtesy from both sides. Prime Minister.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Speaker, if we'd listened to the right honourable gentleman about COVID restrictions, which is the substance of his question, then, Mr. Speaker, we would still be we would have been in lockdown after July. If this is the truth, if we listened to the Labour front bench in the run-up to Christmas and New Year, Mr. Speaker, we would have stayed in restrictions with huge damage to the economy. And it's because of the judgments that I've taken and that we have taken in Downing Street that we now have the fastest growing economy in the G7 and GDP, Mr. Speaker, now back up above pre-pandemic levels. And as for Bury South, Mr. Speaker, as for Bury South, let me say to the right gentleman, Mr. Speaker, by all leave, may I say to the right honourable gentleman that the Conservative Party won Bury South for the first time in generations under this Prime Minister, with an agenda of uniting and levelling up and delivering for the people of Bury South. And, Mr. Speaker, we will win again in Bury South at the next election under this Prime Minister.
Look, it's important I want to hear both sides, and I don't want this continuous chant, because if we do, there'll be less people on these benches, and the same on the other side. I expect both sides to be heard with courtesy. Keir Starmer.
Bury South is now a Labour seat, Prime Minister.
Order. Did somebody want me to apologise? No, somebody shouted apologise. I hope it wasn't aimed at me. No. And so we'll also have less from that corner, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Not only did he write the rules, but some of his staff say they did warn him about attending the party on the 20th of May 2020. Now, I've heard the Prime Minister's very carefully crafted response to that accusation. It almost sounds like a lawyer wrote it. So I'll be equally careful with my question. When did the Prime Minister first become aware that any of his staff had concerns about the 20th of May party?
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to Right Honourable Gentleman for repeating the question that he's already asked. We have answered, Mr. Speaker, that it is for the inquiry to come forward with an explanation of what happened, and I'm afraid he simply must wait. But he asks about my staff, Mr. Speaker. He asks about my staff and what my staff are doing and what they have told me. And I can tell him, Mr. Speaker, that they have taken decisions throughout this pandemic that he has opposed to open up in July, Mr. Speaker, as I have said, to mount the fastest vaccine rollout in Europe, and Mr. Speaker, to double the speed of the booster rollout, with the result that we have the most open economy in Europe, Mr. Speaker, and we have more people in employment and more employees on the payroll now than there were before the pandemic began. That is what my staff have been working on in Downing Street, Mr. Speaker, and I'm proud of them.
Keir Starmer.
So, Mr. Speaker, apparently Sue Gray is going to tell the Prime Minister, when he first became aware that his staff had concerns about the May 20th. The Prime Minister's account gets more extraordinary with each version of his defence. If the Prime Minister's new defence were true, it requires him to suggest that his staff are not being truthful when they say they warned him about the party. It requires the Prime Minister to expect us to believe that whilst every other person who was invited on the 20th of May to the party was told it was a social occasion, he alone was told it was a work meeting. It also requires the Prime Minister to ask us to accept that as he waded through the empty bottles and platters of sandwiches, he didn't realise it was a party. Does the Prime Minister realise how ridiculous that sounds?
Mr. Speaker, I've said what I've said about the events in Number 10. He will have to wait for the report. And Mr. Speaker, I think he asks for further clarification. I think there are lots of people who are interested. I say this entirely in passing, Mr. Speaker. Lots of people are interested in the exact legal justification from the learned leader of the opposition for the picture of him drinking a pint of beer or a bottle of beer. Mr. Speaker, I merely perhaps he could tell the House about that in a minute, Mr. Speaker. But what I can tell the House is that throughout the pandemic, people across government have been working flat out to protect the British public with huge quantities of PPE, so we can now make 80% in this country, with the biggest and most generous furlough scheme virtually anywhere in the world, and the fastest. And by the way, Mr. Speaker, if we listened to them, we would have stayed in the European Medicines Agency, and we would never have been able to deliver the vaccine rollout at the speed that we did.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, if the Prime Minister thinks the only accusation he faces that he once had a beer with a takeaway, then Operation Save Big Dog is in deeper trouble than I thought. If a Prime Minister misleads Parliament, should they resign?
So, Mr. Speaker, let's be absolutely clear. The Right Honourable Gentleman is continuing to ask a series of questions which he knows will be fully addressed by the inquiry. He is wasting this House's time. He's wasting the people's time, Mr. Speaker. He continues to be completely irrelevant, Mr. Speaker, because we have an inquiry. We have an inquiry, Mr. Speaker, and I'm not going to anticipate that inquiry any further. What I can tell him is that it is because of the judgments that were taken in Downing Street and because of the willingness of the British people to put trust, by the way, Mr. Speaker, in those judgments, to come forward in huge numbers to get vaccinated, which people did, and I thank them for it from the bottom of my heart. People did that because they listened to our messages, Mr. Speaker, and it was a result of that that we now have the fastest growing economy in the G7 and youth unemployment, which he ought to care about, youth unemployment at a record low, Mr. Speaker.
Keir Starmer.
Well, I know it's not going well, Prime Minister, but look on the bright side. At least the staff at Number 10 know how to pack a suitcase. Mr. Speaker, last year, Her Majesty the Queen sat alone when she marked the passing of the man she had been married to for 73 years. She followed the rules of the country that she leads. On the eve of that funeral, a suitcase was filled with booze and wheeled into Downing Street. A DJ played and staff partied late into the night. The Prime Minister has been forced to hand an apology to Her Majesty the Queen. Isn't he ashamed that he didn't hand in his resignation at the same time.
Mr. Speaker, I understand why the right honourable gentleman continues to politicise issues.
Sorry, Prime Minister. We normally would not, and quite rightly, mention the royal family. We don't get into discussions on the royal family.
Well, in that case, Mr. Speaker, I must ask the right honourable gentleman to withdraw it.
I've dealt with it. Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer, are you going to...
Won't withdraw it.
Order. Prime Minister, we don't want to go through that again. I'll make the decisions. The answer is that the next question I'm going back to Keir Starmer to ask his final question. Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whilst the Prime Minister wastes energy defending the indefensible, people's energy bills are rocketing. Labour has a plan to deal with it. Axe VAT for everyone, provide extra support for the hardest hit, and pay for it with a one-off tax on oil and gas companies. A serious plan for a serious problem. What's the government offering? Nothing. Too distracted by their own chaos to do their job. While Labour was setting out plans to heat homes, he was buying a fridge to keep the party wine chilled. While we were setting out plans to keep bills down, he was planning parties. And while we were setting out plans to save jobs in the steel industry, he was trying to save just one job, his own. Doesn't the country deserve so much better than this out of touch, out of control, out of ideas, and soon to be out of office Prime Minister?
Mr. Speaker, I'll tell you what this government has been doing to look after the people of this country throughout this pandemic and beyond. We have been cutting the cost of living, helping them with the living wage. We've been cutting taxes for people on low pay, Mr. Speaker. We've been increasing payments for people suffering the costs of fuel.
Prime Minister,
look after people.
Can I just say to everyone in here, our constituents wants to hear the questions and the answers. The great British public, the members of this United Kingdom which you're representing, they need to hear. Please, let's hear the questions and answers. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we will continue to look after people throughout this pandemic and beyond. But we've also, Mr. Speaker, been cutting crime by 10%, putting 11,000 more police officers already out on the street. Record home building last year, Mr. Speaker. More homes than at any time in the last 30 years. We are building 40 new hospitals, Mr. Speaker. Gigabit broadband has gone up from 9% coverage in our country to 65% already. And as I said already, I think 3 times or 4 times today, we have more people, more employees on the payroll now than before the pandemic began. And unemployment, youth unemployment, at a record low, Mr. Speaker. And when the history of this pandemic comes to be written, and the history of the Labour Party comes to be written, and believe me, they are history and will remain history, Mr. Speaker, it will show that we delivered while they dithered, and we vaccinated while they vacillated, Mr. Speaker. And the reason we've been able to lift restrictions faster than any other country in Europe, and we have the most open economy and the most open society in Europe, Mr. Speaker, is thanks to the booster rollout and thanks to the work of staff up and down Whitehall, across government, throughout the NHS, Mr. Speaker, and I am intensely proud of what this government has done.
MP Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week was supposed to be Operation Save Big Dog, but it's quickly become Operation Dog's Dinner. Over the past few days, we've had more damaging revelations about Downing Street rule-making, more evidence that Parliament has been misled, and an even longer list of ludicrous, absolutely ludicrous excuses from the Prime Minister. First he claimed there were no parties, then he wasn't present, then he admitted he was at them, but he didn't know it was a party. And then, Mr. Speaker, the latest sorry excuse. is really the most pathetic of them all. Nobody told me. Nobody told me. Nobody told the Prime Minister he was breaking his own rules. Absolutely pathetic. The Prime Minister, you know, what a look. The Prime Minister laughing once again, laughing at the British public. The Prime Minister is taking the public for fools. Nobody believes him. Will the Prime Minister finally take responsibility, resign, go, Prime Minister?
No, Mr. Speaker, but I thank him for his question again, and let me just remind him that there's an inquiry that is due to conclude. I believe he is wrong in what he asserts, Mr. Speaker, but we'll have to wait and see what the inquiry says. But, Mr. Speaker, I think the most important thing from the point of view of the UK government is that we're coming out of the restrictions that we've been in. I'm delighted to see that that's happening in Scotland as well, and that is very largely thanks to the wonderful cooperation that we continue to see across the whole of the UK, though you wouldn't believe it to hear it from him.
Here, Blackford. Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid nobody is buying this Act anymore. There ought to be some respect and dignity from the Prime Minister. Let's remind ourselves, more than 150,000 of our citizens have died, and he's partying, he's laughing. Mr. Speaker, it simply isn't acceptable. The fake contrition, the endless excuses, the empty promises that it will be different only if we give him one last chance. This is a Prime Minister who arrogantly believes that he's above the rules. A Prime Minister who brazenly twists the truth. A Prime Minister who simply isn't fit for office. The Prime Minister's former Chief Advisor has said that he lied to Parliament, breaking the ministerial code. Prime Minister, a resignation offence. Public trust is hemorrhaging. With every day that passes, this Tory government loses even more credibility. When will the Tory MPs finally do the right thing? Show the Prime Minister the door.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the right honourable gentleman, but I must say that I disagree with him, and I think that when you look at the levels of trust that the British people and people in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, across the whole country have shown in government, that there is the single biggest index, Mr. Speaker, of that trust has been their willingness to come forward voluntarily, Mr. Speaker, unlike many other countries in the world, to get vaccinated on a scale not seen anywhere else in Europe. And that is because of our ability and the NHS's ability to persuade people that it's the right thing. It's a fantastic thing. And by the way, Mr. Speaker, it's also a tribute to the United Kingdom, because that vaccine rollout was a UK effort.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Like many on these benches, I spent weeks and months defending the Prime Minister against often angry constituents. I reminded them of his success in delivering Brexit and on the vaccine and many other things. But I expect my leaders to shoulder the responsibility for the actions they take. Yesterday, he did the opposite of that. So I'll remind him of a quotation altogether too familiar to him of Leo Amery to Neville Chamberlain. You have sat there too long for all the good you have done. In the name of God, go.
Order. Prime Minister.
I must say to the right honourable gentleman, I don't know what he's talking about, but what I can tell him, I don't know what quotation he's alluding to that he's referring. But what I can tell him is that I think I've told this House repeatedly throughout this pandemic, I take full responsibility for everything done in this government and throughout the pandemic.
The knives are out for Boris. The question is he going to resign like Nixon, or is he going to cling on to the power to the very end?
I brought myself down. I gave them a sword, and they stuck it in, and they twisted it with relish. And I guess if I had been in their position, I'd have done the same thing.
If you enjoyed this video, please take note there are others available to you on the channel. And while I've got you here, please consider pressing the like button. The more likes, the more my videos get shared around. The more the videos get shared around, the more money I can make, and that means more opportunity to destroy the Tory party. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed my political observations this week. If you'd like to support me, please share the video with others and post about it on social media. If you're keen for more, subscribe, comment, like, and hit that notification button. Thanks for listening, and see you next time on Political X.